The wind howled through the dark alley, sending icy gusts between the abandoned buildings. Trash lay scattered across the frozen pavement, brittle and stiff from the relentless winter chill. The distant hum of the city barely reached this forgotten corner, where streetlights flickered weakly, casting long, eerie shadows. Each gust of wind carried with it the sharp bite of ice, cutting through layers of clothing like knives. The night was merciless, and for anything left exposed, survival was not guaranteed. Huddled near a rusting dumpster, a German shepherd lay curled in on himself, his once thick fur now matted and patchy with grime. His ribs jutted out beneath his skin, a silent testament to the hunger that gnawed at him. Each breath came in shuddering gasps, his body trembling from more than just the cold. His eyes, dim yet alert, darted between the alley's entrances, wary of unseen threats. A survivor of countless nights like this, he clung to the last shreds of strength he had left, waiting for morning. If it came. Jake pulled his hood lower, his breath visible in the freezing air. Each step felt heavier, not just from exhaustion, but from the ghosts that followed him. A former Marine, he had seen war, loss, and things no man should have to carry. Civilian life had not welcomed him back with open arms, and he had stopped trying to fit in long ago. His hands clenched into fists inside his pockets, his mind lost in memories of sandstorms and gunfire. The alley was his escape, the only place where silence didn't remind him of everything he had lost. Just as Jake passed the dumpster, a faint sound cut through the howling wind. A whimper, weak, almost lost in the night. His steps faltered, muscles tensing instinctively. Training had conditioned him to notice the smallest disturbances, and this was no different. He turned his head slightly, listening. Another whimper. Desperate. His throat tightened. He had spent years trying to tune out suffering, to tell himself the world was beyond saving. But something about that sound clawed at him. Something raw, something that demanded to be acknowledged. Jake exhaled sharply, forcing himself to keep walking. He had nothing to give, not to himself, not to anyone else. But the whimper came again, weaker this time. His feet slowed. What difference could he make? He was barely holding himself together. Yet his instincts, those instincts that had kept him alive in war, screamed at him not to turn his back. He cursed under his breath. Helping meant opening himself up again. It meant caring. And caring. Caring was dangerous. But even as he thought it, he knew he was already turning back. Jake crouched down, his breath misting in the frigid air. The dog shrank back, eyes locked onto him with a mixture of fear and hope. Jake saw it then, the same wariness he saw in himself every time he looked in the mirror. Slowly, he extended a hand. The shepherd flinched, but didn't move away. "You and I both, huh?" Jake murmured, his voice rough. The dog's eyes searched for him, hesitant, pleading. A silent agreement passed between them. Neither of them knew it yet, but in that moment their fates had intertwined forever. The alley was silent, except for the distant hum of passing cars. Jake crouched low, extending a cautious hand toward the trembling German shepherd. The dog flinched, shrinking back into the shadows, his body quivering from more than just the cold. Jake's breath hitched, the shepherd's eyes, deep, haunted, locked onto his own, a silent plea hidden in their depths. Desperation, fear, a last thread of hope. He wasn't growling, wasn't baring his teeth, just watching, waiting, uncertain. The connection sent a shiver down Jake's spine. He had seen that look before, in the mirror, a soul battered and abandoned, unsure if reaching out would lead to salvation or more pain. Jake inched forward, scanning the shepherd's frail body. As the dim light of the street lamp fell on the dog's frame, his breath caught. Scars. Thin, jagged lines crisscrossing his matted fur. Some old, faded into patches of missing hair, others raw, angry welts that spoke of recent cruelty. A lump formed in Jake's throat. Someone had hurt this animal, left him out here to rot. The sight stirred something deep within him. Anger, sorrow, a burning need to undo what had been done. The shepherd shifted, wincing as his weight shifted on thin, wobbly legs. He was starving, broken. Jake clenched his fists, his own past flashing through his mind, fists yelling, the sting of betrayal. He swallowed hard. This dog had suffered. Just like him. He exhaled sharply, running a tired hand through his hair. He was barely holding himself together. How could he take in a dog? He had nothing to offer. No home, no stability. Just a tiny apartment filled with ghosts of his past. But then those eyes met him again, filled with quiet desperation. No growl, no resistance, just waiting, hoping. Jake cursed under his breath. He knew himself well enough. He wasn't walking away. With careful movements, he shrugged off his jacket and inched closer. "All right, buddy," he murmured, gently wrapping the warm fabric around the shivering shepherd. "Let's get you out of here." The dog didn't resist, didn't fight, just let out a quiet, exhausted sigh. Jake slid his arms under the shepherd's frail body and lifted him. He was too light. Bones pressed against Jake's palms, a reminder of just how long this dog had suffered. The wind howled around them, slicing through the alley like a cruel whisper. Jake adjusted his grip, cradling the fragile animal closer. Each step felt heavier than the last. Not just from the weight in his arms, but from the realization pressing on his chest. He wasn't just carrying a dog, he was carrying something broken, something abandoned, like himself. As the streetlights guided him home, Jake glanced down. The shepherd's head rested against his chest, his breathing shallow but steady. Trusting him, even after everything. Inside his small apartment, Jake set the dog down on an old blanket. The shepherd barely moved, his ribs rising and falling with slow, labored breaths. Jake worked quickly, rummaging through the kitchen. A can of tuna, some old bread. It wasn't much, but it was something. He placed the food in a bowl and set it down. The shepherd didn't move. His tired eyes flicked from the food to Jake, hesitant, unsure. With slow, careful hands, Jake reached for a damp towel. "Let's get you cleaned up." He dabbed gently at the raw wounds, expecting resistance, a flinch, anything. But the dog barely reacted, too exhausted, too broken. Jake swallowed hard. He knew that feeling all too well. Jake leaned back against the wall, watching the shepherd from across the room. The dog stared back, curled in a tight ball, his body still trembling. They were strangers. Two lost souls, both scarred by the past, now sitting in the same silence. Jake exhaled slowly. He had never thought about saving anything before, not a person, not himself. But looking at the shepherd, something inside him shifted. Maybe this wasn't just about rescuing a dog. Maybe, just maybe, saving this animal meant saving himself, too. The first rays of morning light filter through the cabin window. Jake stretches, his muscles aching from the previous night's restless sleep. Across the room, the stray German shepherd, now unofficially his house guest, watches him with cautious amber eyes. Jake moves slowly, careful not to startle the dog. He sets a bowl of food on the floor and steps back, giving the animal space. Max, at least that's what Jake started calling him in his mind, doesn't move at first. His ears twitch, nose flaring as he scents the food, but his body remains tense as if expecting a trick. Jake doesn't push. He simply walks away, leaving Max to make his own decision. The quiet sound of retreating footsteps fills the cabin. A moment later, a soft rustling follows, the tentative scrape of paws inching toward the food. Jake doesn't turn around. Trust isn't forced. It's earned. Jake sits at the table, pretending not to watch. His heart pounds with anticipation. The dog hesitates, sniffing at the food with wary precision. Hunger gnaws at him, battling the fear still rooted deep within. Then, at last, a decision. Max lowers his head and takes a bite. It's quick, cautious, as if expecting the meal to be snatched away. When nothing happens, he eats another, then another. The tension in his body lessens, just slightly. Jake exhales, a breath he didn't realize he was holding. It's a small step, but a step nonetheless. He doesn't move, doesn't speak. He simply watches from a distance, offering silent reassurance. Trust is fragile, but it's beginning to form. Days pass in careful silence. Max eats his meals but keeps his distance, his eyes always watchful. Jake never pushes, never forces. He simply exists alongside him, waiting. One evening, as he sets down the bowl, he says it, softly, carefully. Max. The reaction is subtle, but unmistakable. The dog stiffens, ears twitching at the sound. For a moment there is only silence. Then, slowly, Max turns his head toward Jake, amber eyes meeting his own. It's not much, just a name, an acknowledgement. But in that quiet exchange something shifts. A connection, faint but real, takes root. The nightmares always come in waves. Tonight is no different. Jake jerks awake, his breath ragged, sweat clinging to his skin. Shadows from the past claw at his mind, pulling him back to a time he'd rather forget. He presses his hands to his face, trying to steady himself. Then, a sound. A soft shuffle on the wooden floor. He looks up. Max stands a few feet away, watching him. His posture is neither fearful nor aggressive, just present. A silent observer of Jake's pain. Jake lets out a slow, uneven breath. He doesn't move, doesn't call the dog closer. But Max, cautious yet sure, takes a step forward. Then another. He settles near the bed, curling up, his presence solid and grounding. For the first time in a long time, Jake doesn't feel completely alone. The quiet morning is shattered by a sudden, sharp crack. A car backfires on the road outside. Instantly, Max's body reacts. He flinches, eyes wide, before bolting under the table. His breath comes in short, rapid bursts, tail tucked tight against his body. Jake's heart clenches. He recognizes that reaction all too well. Slowly, he crouches down, keeping his voice low and steady. "Hey, it's okay, you're safe." He doesn't move closer, doesn't reach out. Instead, he waits. Minutes pass before Max's trembling slows. He peeks out, hesitant but searching. Jake stays where he is, offering nothing but patience. Whatever scars Max carries, they run deep. But Jake knows he's not alone in that. Progress isn't a straight line. Some days, Max follows Jake from room to room, his presence a quiet shadow. Other days, a sudden movement, a raised hand, an unexpected sound sends him recoiling, old instincts flaring to life. Jake never scolds him, never forces him closer. Healing isn't about erasing the past, it's about learning to exist despite it. So, he gives Max space when he needs it. He offers reassurance without expectation. And slowly, moment by moment, the hesitation begins to fade. One evening, as Jake sits on the porch, Max approaches unprompted. He settles beside Jake, close but not touching. Just being there, and for now, that's enough. The morning air is crisp, laced with the scent of pine and damp earth. Jake and Max walk side by side, their breath visible in the chill. The leash is loose in Jake's hand, but Max stays close, moving in a quiet tandem. His steps are steady, purposeful. Then, without warning, a shift. Max leans against Jake's leg just slightly, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in quiet reassurance. Jake slows, feeling the weight of that moment. He looks down, meeting Max's eyes. There's trust there, unspoken yet undeniable. A small smile tugs at Jake's lips. He reaches out, this time knowing Max won't pull away. He rests a hand on the dog's head, fingers threading through thick fur. Good boy. Max doesn't flinch, don't retreat. Instead, he stays right where he is. Together, they keep walking, two souls, healing in tandem. The evening air was still, the quiet hum of the city settling around Jake and Max as they walked along the dimly lit street. The German shepherd trotted beside him, his ears perked, his posture relaxed. But then, a soft whistle cut through the silence. Sharp, deliberate. A sound meant for someone. Max stopped dead in his tracks. Jake turned, confused by the sudden halt. Max's body had gone rigid, his tail tucked tightly, ears flattened against his head. The transformation was instant. This wasn't just fear, it was something deeper. Then came a voice from the shadows, low and familiar. "Rex?" Max flinched. Jake's stomach tightened. That wasn't his name. Not anymore. But it had been once. A man stepped forward, emerging from the glow of a street lamp. His frame was tall, his stance confident. But there was something else. A quiet authority that made Jake's instincts bristle. "That's my dog," the man said, voice firm, measured. "I've been looking for him." Jake barely had time to process the words before Max began trembling. He didn't step forward. He didn't wag his tail. He stood frozen, his dark eyes flickering between Jake and the stranger. A silent plea. A desperate question. "Are you going to let him take me?" Jake's grip tightened on the leash. "What do you mean, your dog?" he asked cautiously. The man scoffed, shifting his weight. "I mean exactly that. He's mine." His gaze flickered to Max, and something in his voice hardened. "Come on, Rex." Max didn't move. Jake watched as the man's composure cracked, just slightly. His jaw clenched, his tone turning sharp. "You think he belongs to you?" There was no warmth in his words, no relief at finding a lost pet. Just ownership, control. Jake saw it then, the way Max recoiled, the slight flinch in his muscles at the sound of that name. Rex. He had lived under this man's rule once, and he had no intention of going back. A lump formed in Jake's throat. Legally, he had nothing. No paperwork, no records. Just a leash, a name tag, and a bond built on months of trust. But in his gut he knew, handing Max over would be wrong. "He's mine," the man repeated, stepping closer. "Hand him over, or I'll call the cops." Jake's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He could argue, he could reason, but nothing logical was going to change the fact that this man had lost Max for a reason, and Max had chosen not to return. His voice came out steady, unwavering. "Max is not going anywhere with you." The man let out a sharp breath, his patience wearing thin. "You don't have a choice." Jake didn't back down. Neither does he. Max remained planted at his side, unmoving. A shadow of fear still lingered in his dark eyes. But now, something else burned beneath it. The tension snapped like a pulled wire. The man lunged forward, reaching for Max's collar. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from Max's throat, the kind Jake had never heard from him before. It wasn't out of fear, it wasn't a warning. It was a statement, a boundary being drawn for the first time in his life. The man hesitated, His outstretched hand froze midair. Max stepped forward, not toward him, but in front of Jake, his stance protective. His muscles still trembled, but his decision was clear. He would rather stand his ground than go back. Jake's chest tightened, pride swelling alongside his rage. I think he just made his choice. The man's face darkened. He glanced between Max and Jake, weighing his next move. Then, with a sharp exhale, he took a step back. You'll regret this, he muttered before turning on his heel and storming off into the night. The street fell silent again. Jake knelt beside Max, his fingers running through the shepherd's fur. His body was still shaking, his breaths uneven. But his eyes met Jake's, steady, relieved. You did good, buddy, Jake whispered. Max let out a soft whine, pressing his head against Jake's chest. That night, Jake made a decision. No more doubts, no more what-ifs. At sunrise, he would file for official adoption. Max wasn't just his dog at heart. He would make it legal, permanent. Because some bonds, no matter what the past says, aren't meant to be broken. The crisp paper trembled slightly in Jake's hands as he reread the words that made it official. Max was his. Legal adoption papers, signed and sealed. A deep breath shuddered through him as he traced the embossed seal at the bottom. After all the losses, all the nights staring into nothing, he had something, someone, to fight for again. At his feet, Max sat attentively, his golden brown eyes fixed on Jake. As if sensing the weight of the moment, he nudged Jake's knee with his damp nose, his tail giving a slow, hopeful wag. Jake knelt, running his fingers through Max's fur, now thick and soft instead of the rough, matted coat it once was. You're home now, buddy, he murmured. Max exhaled through his nose, resting his head against Jake's chest. For the first time in years, Jake felt something settle inside him. It wasn't just relief, it was belonging. Months ago, Max had been a shadow of the dog he was now. His ribs had pressed sharply against his skin, his fur dull and lifeless, his eyes filled with haunted wariness. But under Jake's care, Max had transformed. His coat now gleamed under the sun, golden and rich, a testament to warmth and safety. The tension that once gripped his muscles had melted away, replaced with an easy, confident gait. At the park, Max ran with effortless joy, his legs stretching in long, powerful strides. He no longer flinched at sudden noises. He still observed strangers with cautious curiosity, but gone was the trembling fear. He was learning that not all hands harmed, that not all voices shouted. One day, as they walked past a child tossing a ball, Max hesitated before wagging his tail. The child grinned, rolling the ball toward him. Max sniffed it, then, to Jake's quiet surprise, nudged it back. It was small, but it was progress. As Max healed, so did Jake. The nights that once suffocated him with nightmares became quieter. Sleep came easier, steadier. The relentless weight on his shoulders lightened, bit by bit. One evening, Max curled at his feet as Jake stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact list. He hadn't spoken to his sister in years, not since before. The past had wedged too much distance between them, but now something inside him whispered that it was time. Taking a steadying breath, he tapped her name. The phone rang once, twice, then a hesitant voice answered. Jake? His throat tightened. Hey, Liv, it's been a while. Silence stretched, then a small shaky laugh. Yeah, it has. Max lifted his head, ears twitching at the sound of Jake's voice softening. The past wasn't erased, but maybe, just maybe, it wasn't unfixable either. The evening air was cool, the sky a vast canvas of stars. Jake sat on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, while Max lay beside him, eyes half-lidded in contentment. His tail thumped lazily against the wooden floorboards as he dreamed. Jake tilted his head back, staring at the constellations. He had spent years searching for something to anchor him, and yet, all along, it had come in the form of a scrappy, resilient dog who had refused to give up. He reached down, ruffling Max's ears. "We made it, buddy," he murmured. Max stirred, lifting his head. He blinked sleepily at Jake before leaning in, pressing his nose against Jake's palm. A quiet understanding passed between them, one built not just on rescue but on something far deeper. They had saved each other, and that was enough. As the night deepened, Jake exhaled, the weight of old wounds fading into the starlit horizon. For the first time in a long time, he was home. Jake sat on his porch, watching Max chase fireflies under the moonlight. Not long ago he had been a man lost in his own darkness, drowning in regret and loneliness. Max had been astray, abandoned, and forgotten. But together they had rewritten their stories. No one is beyond redemption. Jake and Max proved that second chances could transform lives. Max had given Jake a reason to wake up each morning, and in return, Jake had given Max a home filled with love. They weren't perfect, but they were whole, because sometimes all it takes is one chance to change everything. Jake didn't need words to understand Max. The way the dog rested his head on his knee on bad days, or how his tail wagged when Jake smiled, it was enough. Through quiet companionship, they mended the wounds time couldn't heal. Jake had spent years running from his past, but Max had shown him a different path, one where love didn't need explanations, only presence. They weren't just man and dog. They were two souls who had saved each other in silence. Jake had thought he was rescuing Max that night, pulling him from the storm, giving him shelter. But he saw the truth now. Max had rescued him too. He had pulled Jake from a deeper storm, one that raged inside his heart. It was never just about saving a stray dog. It was about finding a reason to keep going. Max hadn't just entered Jake's life. He had given him a new one. Looking into Max's trusting eyes, Jake felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. He had spent so long believing he was alone, but he wasn't. He never would be again. With Max by his side, the past no longer haunted him. The future was no longer empty. He had found his home,